August 15th, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. The Mediterranean Sea rolls dark and heavy beneath a moonless sky, and along the southern coast of France between Toulon and Cannes, the night holds its breath. In the pre-dawn darkness, thousands of men crouch in landing craft, feeling the rhythmic slam of waves against steel hulls, tasting salt spray mixed with diesel fumes and fear. Some pray, others smoke their last cigarettes before the boats hit the beaches. Many simply stare into the black water, wondering if they'll see tomorrow. Above them, the stars are disappearing, swallowed by something vast and terrible, moving through the sky wave after wave of transport aircraft, their engines drowning out the sea, carrying paratroopers toward their appointments with destiny in the hills of Provence. This is Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, and in less than an hour, one of the largest amphibious assaults in military history will explode across these beaches. Yet somehow, 70 years later, most people have never heard of it. They remember Normandy, rightly so. But this forgotten D-Day, this second invasion that involved nearly as many troops and ships, has faded into the margins of history books, overshadowed by its famous older sibling. But make no mistake, what happened here in the summer of 1944 wasn't just a footnote. It was a strategic masterstroke that tore open Hitler's fortress Europe from the south, liberated an entire region in less than 2 weeks, and fundamentally altered the course of the war in Western Europe. So why don't we remember it? And more importantly, what really happened on those beaches when the sun came up that August morning? To understand Operation Dragoon, you have to rewind the clock to the summer of 1943, when Allied leaders gathered in Washington for the Trident Conference, smoking cigars in wood-paneled rooms while deciding the fate of millions. The invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, was already on the drawing board, but the Americans, particularly General George Marshall and President Franklin Roosevelt, wanted something more. They wanted a complementary operation, a second front that would strike France from the Mediterranean, drawing German forces away from Normandy, opening up southern ports to bring in supplies, and ultimately linking up with Eisenhower's forces driving east from the Normandy beaches. The British, led by Winston Churchill, were skeptical, even hostile to the idea. Churchill had his own vision. He wanted to push up through Italy, into the Balkans, beat the Soviets to Eastern Europe, and contain Stalin's post-war ambitions. He called the proposed southern France invasion a waste of resources, a diversion from what really mattered. The tension between these two visions, the American preference for direct, overwhelming force versus Churchill's more peripheral, politically motivated strategy, would simmer for months, creating bitter arguments behind closed doors. Initially, the operation was called Anvil, meant to be the hammer to Overlord's anvil, crushing the Wehrmacht between two massive blows. But everything that could go wrong with the planning did go wrong. The Italian campaign consumed more resources than anticipated. Normandy took priority, landing craft was scarce, and by the spring of 1944, Anvil had been postponed, then nearly cancelled altogether. Churchill fought it tooth and nail, even after Overlord succeeded in June. But the Americans wouldn't budge, and Stalin, who desperately wanted pressure kept on Germany from all sides, backed them up. Finally, grudgingly, Churchill relented, but insisted on one small, bitter consolation. They would rename the operation Dragoon because, as he sourly joked, he had been dragooned into accepting it. By late July 1944, the wheels were in motion. The invasion would be commanded by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch, a methodical, understated officer who led the U.S. 7th Army of Force that included battle-hardened American divisions, the entire French Army B under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, a force burning with the desire to liberate their homeland, and a small but elite contingent of Canadian and British troops. In total, nearly 300,000 men would participate in the initial assault and follow-up operations. The target was an 80-mile stretch of coastline in Provence between the ancient port cities of Toulon and Cannes, some of the most beautiful beaches in Europe, now bristling with German defences. The area was held by General Johannes Blaskowitz's Army Group G, a force that had been steadily weakened by transfers to the Normandy front, but still included 11 divisions, many of them second-rate occupation units, but also some capable Wehrmacht and SS formations. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They just didn't know exactly where or when. And critically, by August 1944, the Luftwaffe was a broken force. The German Navy, nearly non-existent in the Mediterranean, which meant the Allies would have near total air and naval supremacy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but staggering in its complexity. First, elite airborne forces would drop inland before dawn, seizing key routes and blocking German reinforcements. Then, at dawn, a massive naval bombardment would pulverize German defenses, followed by the main amphibious assault across 3 beach sectors, Alpha, Delta, and Camel each, with its own objectives, challenges, and horrors. If everything went according to plan, the Allies would be pushing inland by noon, racing up the Rhone Valley, trapping German forces, and linking up with Patton's Third Army somewhere near the German border within weeks. But war never goes according to plan. The first men into France weren't the ones on the beaches, they came from the sky. At 10 minutes past midnight on August 15, 1944, the American-British 1st Airborne Task Force began jumping over the rugged terrain of the Var region, northwest of the planned beach landings. This was the largest airborne operation launched from the Mediterranean theatre. More than 9,000 paratroopers and glider infantry commanded by Major General Robert Frederick, the legendary leader of the Devil's Brigade, a man who had been wounded 8 times in combat and kept going back for more. The mission was critical but terrifyingly difficult. Land in the dark over unfamiliar, heavily forested terrain, secure the high ground, block the main roads, and prevent German armour from reaching the beaches. The drops were scattered. Some units landed within meters of their drop zones. Others came down miles away in vineyards, olive groves, and medieval villages, hitting trees, power lines, and rooftops. There was confusion, small unit chaos, the kind of fog of war where a young lieutenant suddenly finds himself commanding a mixed group of men from 3 different units, none of whom know where they are, armed with whatever they managed to hang on to during the jump. But in that confusion, something remarkable emerged: initiative, improvisation, and courage. Small teams of paratroopers, sometimes just 3 or 4 men, began attacking German positions, cutting communication lines, ambushing convoys, creating havoc far beyond their numbers. They fought through the night in the darkness, using cricket clickers to identify friend from foe, whispering passwords, creeping through vineyards and forests, engaging in desperate firefights at point-blank range. By dawn, they hadn't achieved all their objectives. Some units were still scattered, some drop zones were in German hands, but they had done something more important. They had created chaos in the German rear, confused their commanders, delayed reinforcements, and most critically, they had seized key terrain overlooking the invasion beaches. While the paratroopers were fighting inland, the greatest armada ever assembled in the Mediterranean was approaching the French coast. More than 880 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport vessels, landing craft, and support ships stretched across miles of sea, moving through the darkness in precise formation. This wasn't the improvised, barely controlled chaos of earlier amphibious operations in North Africa or Sicily. This was industrial-scale invasion, refined by years of hard lessons, executed with the methodical precision of a well-oiled machine. The men aboard those ships came from everywhere. American farm boys from Kansas and factory workers from Detroit, French soldiers who had fled their country 4 years earlier and were finally coming home, experienced veterans of Sicily and Italy who thought they'd seen it all, and nervous replacements making their first combat jumps into history. Below decks, the air was thick and stifling, thick with the smell of oil, sweat, vomit, and fear. Some men tried to sleep but couldn't. Others wrote last letters, checked and rechecked their equipment, or simply sat in silence, each man alone with his thoughts. Chaplains moved through the crowded spaces, offering prayers and comfort. Medics organized their supplies, knowing that in a few hours they would be fighting a different kind of battle, one measured not in ground taken, but in lives saved. Officers studied maps one last time, though many had the landing zones memorized down to individual rocks and defensive positions. And slowly, inexorably, the ships moved closer to shore. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the naval bombardment began. For 50 minutes, the darkness erupted in sound and fury as battleships like the USS Texas, the USS Nevada, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor and raised from the mud, and the French battleship Lorraine opened fire with their massive guns, hurling shells the size of automobiles at German bunkers and artillery positions. Cruisers and destroyers joined in, creating a rolling thunder that could be heard 50 miles inland, a sound so overwhelming that men on the landing craft felt it in their chests, a physical presence that made conversation impossible. The pre-dawn sky lit up with muzzle flashes and explosions, turning night into a flickering, hellish daylight. Rockets screamed overhead in waves, arcing toward the shore, designed to detonate mines and tear apart beach obstacles. And above it all, Allied aircraft medium bombers and fighters roared over the beaches, dropping bombs, strafing anything that moved, turning the German defensive positions into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. The Germans, many of them already demoralized by defeats in Normandy and Russia, huddled in their bunkers, praying the concrete would hold, knowing that when the shelling stopped, the real nightmare would begin. Some positions were obliterated, crews buried alive under tons of earth and concrete. Others survived, dazed but functional, manning their machine guns and mortars, waiting for targets. At 5:07 in the morning, the naval guns lifted their fire, shifting to targets further inland. In the sudden, relative quiet, broken only by the sound of engines and waves, the landing craft began their final run toward the beaches. It was time. The first wave hit the beaches at exactly 08 hours, and what happened next was both terrifying and, in comparison to Omaha Beach 2 months earlier, almost miraculous. The beaches of Provence, given the codenames Alpha, Delta, and Camel, were not the killing fields that many had feared. The massive aerial and naval bombardment had done its job, pulverizing many German positions, cutting communication lines, and leaving the defenders stunned and disorganized. Even more importantly, the German forces here were not the elite troops that had defended Normandy. Many were older men, conscripted foreign troops from Eastern Europe who had little desire to die for Hitler's Reich, and units already demoralized by years of retreating. But that doesn't mean it was easy. On certain sectors of the beach, particularly around Saint-Raphael, German resistance was fierce and deadly. Machine gun nests that had survived the bombardment opened up as the landing craft dropped their ramps, cutting through the first men off the boats with precise, practiced bursts of fire. Artillery shells began falling among the landing craft, sending up geysers of water and shrapnel. Men jumped into water that was chest deep, struggling to move forward against the weight of their equipment, the push of waves and the pull of fear. Some were hit before they reached dry sand, crumpling into the water, turning the surf red. Others made it to the beach, only to find themselves pinned down, hugging the sand, unable to move forward or back, caught in the terrible calculus of combat, where staying still means death, but moving forward feels impossible. But the Allies had learned from Normandy. They had specialized armor Sherman tanks modified with flails to clear mines, flamethrower tanks to burn out bunkers, engineer teams trained to blow obstacles and clear paths. They had overwhelming firepower. Destroyers came in so close to shore, they were practically beaching themselves, firing point blank at German positions. And they had numbers wave after wave of landing craft, so many men and machines that even when one unit was pinned down, another would land 50 yards away and push forward, finding gaps in the defense, flanking stubborn positions, slowly but steadily cracking the German line. By mid-morning, the beachheads were secured. By noon, American troops were pushing inland, moving through the pine forests and coastal villages of Provence, encountering scattered resistance, but nothing like the grinding, yard-by-yard horror of Normandy. The French troops particularly moved with a ferocity born of 4 years of occupation, humiliation, and exile. For them, this wasn't just a military operation. It was liberation. It was reclamation. It was revenge. They pushed forward faster than the plan called for, sometimes too fast, driven by an emotional force that staff officers couldn't quantify on their maps. In the villages they passed through, doors flew open and people emerged, old men, women, children, at first cautiously, unable to believe what they were seeing, then with growing joy and disbelief. The Germans were retreating. The Allies were here. France was being liberated, not meter by bloody meter like in Normandy, but in great, sweeping advances. By the end of the first day, Allied forces had pushed 6 to 10 miles inland, captured thousands of German prisoners, and secured a lodgment that would have taken weeks to achieve in Normandy. The cost had been surprisingly light, fewer than 200 killed on the first day, compared to thousands at Omaha Beach. It seemed almost too good to be true, and in the heady euphoria of that first day, some wondered if the Germans were broken, if the war in France might be over within weeks. But war is never that simple. As the Allies pushed inland, the terrain changed from coastal beaches to the rugged, complicated landscape of Provence narrow roads, winding through hills, forests, vineyards, medieval towns, with stone buildings perfect for defense, bridges over rivers that could be easily demolished. And while Army Group G was retreating, it wasn't collapsing. General Blaskowitz, a capable and experienced officer, was conducting a fighting withdrawal, delaying actions designed to slow the Allied advance while the bulk of his forces escaped up the Rhone Valley. German rearguards would occupy a village or a key crossroads, fight until they were about to be encircled, then pull back to the next position, blow the bridges, mine the roads, and do it all over again. It was frustrating, exhausting work for the advancing Allies, who found themselves constantly having to stop, deploy, fight a short, sharp engagement, then reorganize and move forward again, only to repeat the process a few miles down the road. The French resistance. The Maquis played a crucial role here, emerging from the forests and mountains to attack German columns, guide Allied troops, provide intelligence, and liberate towns before the regular forces arrived. These were men and women who had fought a shadow war for years, sabotaging railways, assassinating collaborators, surviving on courage and hope. Now, finally, they were fighting alongside regular armies, and their local knowledge proved invaluable. But the war was still deadly. Snipers haunted the streets of liberated towns. German artillery would suddenly open up from hidden positions, catching advancing columns on open roads. Mines were everywhere, in roads, in fields, in doorways and bicycle paths. Young men who had survived the beach landings were killed by a roadside bomb or a mortar around 3 days later. Their names added to casualty lists that would never be as famous as Normandy's, but were no less final. The Americans raced north, and the French forces wheeled west toward Toulon and Marseille, the two major port cities that were the strategic objectives of the entire operation. Taking these ports intact was crucial. They would allow the Allies to bring in supplies directly from the United States, bypassing the congested beaches and the long supply lines stretching back from Normandy. The Germans knew this too, and Hitler had ordered both cities to be held to the last man, to be destroyed if necessary, rather than fall intact into Allied hands. What followed in late August was brutal urban combat, street by street, building by building, the French forces driven by pride and fury, assaulting fortified positions with artillery, tanks, and sheer willpower. The fighting in Toulon and Marseille was some of the fiercest of the entire operation. German garrisons making their stands in forts and bunkers designed to withstand naval bombardment. French troops storming them with flamethrowers and satchel charges, fighting through tunnels and bunkers in darkness, lit only by muzzle flashes and explosions. Both cities fell ahead of scheduled. Toulon on August 27th, Marseille on August 28th, captured not in the weeks that planners had expected, but in days. It was a stunning achievement, driven by the skill of the French troops and the desperation of the German defenders, whose fight to the last man orders dissolved in the face of reality. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered, and while both ports had been damaged, they were nowhere near as destroyed as Hitler had ordered. Within weeks, both would be operational, and by September, they would be handling more tonnage than all the beaches in Normandy combined. By early September, less than 3 weeks after the initial landings, Operation Dragoon had achieved all of its strategic objectives, and then some. The Allies controlled southern France from the Mediterranean to Lyon, had captured 2 major ports, destroyed or captured 8 German divisions, and were racing north up the Rhone Valley, covering distances in days that would have taken months in Italy. On September 11, 1944, less than a month after the landing patrols from the US, 7th Army linked up with patrols from Patton's 3rd Army near Dijon, creating a continuous Allied front from the English Channel to the Swiss border. It was one of the most successful campaigns of the entire war, a textbook example of combined arms operations, strategic planning, and aggressive execution. The casualties, by World War II standards, had been relatively light, about 7,000 Allied killed, wounded, or missing during the initial assault and the drive inland, compared to tens of thousands in Normandy. The Germans lost far more killed, wounded, or captured. Army Group G effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, its remnants fleeing east toward the German border in disarray. The French people, particularly in the south, were liberated not by slow, grinding advances, but by a lightning campaign that left them breathless with joy and disbelief. Villages that had suffered 4 years of occupation were free in a matter of days. The speed of the advance meant that much of the region's infrastructure, roads, bridges, factories, was captured relatively intact, sparing France the kind of wholesale destruction that had marked liberation in Normandy. Yet despite its success, Operation Dragoon has faded from popular memory, relegated to a footnote in most histories of World War II. There are several reasons for this collective amnesia. First, timing: it happened 2 months after Normandy, and by the standards of public attention, it was old news. The dramatic, against all odds survival story of Omaha Beach had already captured the world's imagination, and a relatively easy landing in southern France simply couldn't compete for headlines. Second, the operation was overshadowed by events happening simultaneously. Paris was liberated on August 25th, just 10 days after Dragoon began, and that event, with all its symbolic and emotional power, dominated news coverage and later historical memory. Third, there was the political dimension. Churchill never liked the operation and rarely spoke of it positively in his post-war memoirs, which shaped British historical narratives. The Americans, meanwhile, were focused on Eisenhower's drive across northern Europe, the drama of Market Garden, and the looming Battle of the Bulge. Dragoon simply didn't fit the narrative arc that historians and filmmakers preferred. It was too successful, too easy, lacking the desperate heroism that makes for compelling drama. But this forgetting comes at a cost, because it obscures a crucial truth about the defeat of Nazi Germany. It wasn't accomplished by one dramatic landing, or one brilliant general, or one heroic stand. It was accomplished by relentless, coordinated pressure on multiple fronts, by logistics and planning as much as courage, by the ability to execute not just one massive operation, but several simultaneously, stretching German resources past the breaking point. The soldiers who fought in Operation Dragoon came home to a country that was already celebrating other battles, other heroes. Many felt a strange sense of erasure, as if their war had been less important, less real, than the war their buddies had fought in Normandy or the Pacific. Veterans would spend decades telling people they had landed in southern France and seeing blank looks in return. The polite confusion of people who knew about D-Day but had never heard of Dragoon. Some stopped talking about it altogether, their stories dying with them, uncollected and unrecorded. The French troops, who had fought with such ferocity to liberate their own country, found themselves marginalized in a post-war narrative that emphasized Anglo-American contributions and downplayed French participation. The Maquis fighters, who had risked everything in the underground resistance, were often forgotten entirely or remembered only in France itself, unknown to the wider world. And General Patch, the quiet, methodical commander who had orchestrated one of the most successful campaigns of the war, remained largely unknown, overshadowed by more flamboyant personalities like Patton, Montgomery, and Bradley. He would die in 1945, just months after the war ended, his achievements already fading from public consciousness, his name destined to appear only in specialized military histories and footnotes. But the strategic importance of Operation Dragoon cannot be overstated. The ports of Marseille and Toulon became the primary supply route for Allied forces in southern France, handling more cargo than any other Allied port system in Europe except Antwerp. The rapid advance up the Rhone Valley shortened the war, forcing the Germans to defend a much longer front with increasingly scarce resources, preventing them from concentrating forces for any kind of effective counter-offensive. The liberation of southern France freed up French military and civilian resources, allowing France to contribute more to the final defeat of Germany. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that by the summer of 1944, the Allies had become so powerful, so skilled at combined arms operations, that they could launch and sustain multiple major invasions simultaneously, something that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. This wasn't luck. It was mastery of logistics, of coordination, of technology, of the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. It was the moment when victory stopped being a hope and became an inevitability, when the question shifted from whether Germany would be defeated to when and how. Standing on those beaches today, in the peaceful resort towns of the French Riviera, it's almost impossible to imagine what happened there in August 1944. The bunkers are still there, slowly crumbling into the earth, covered with vines and graffiti, monuments that few tourists notice. The cemeteries are quiet and well maintained, rows of white crosses, and stars of David marking the resting places of men who died liberating a country most of them had never seen before. Local French communities still hold commemorations every August 15th, ceremonies attended by a dwindling number of veterans, fewer each year, old men returning one last time to the beaches where they were young and afraid and brave. But for most of the world, Operation Dragoon remains what it has always been, the forgotten D-Day, the second invasion, the footnote to Normandy. Yet those who were there knew the truth, knew what they had accomplished, knew that the ground they took and the miles they covered mattered, even if history chose to look elsewhere. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the real measure of a battle's importance isn't how much it's remembered, but what it accomplished. By that standard, Operation Dragoon was one of the most important operations of World War II, a perfectly executed campaign that shortened the war, saved countless lives, and helped destroy the most evil regime in modern history. That it did so without becoming legend doesn't make it any less significant. It just makes it forgotten. And perhaps, finally, it's time we remembered.